why I'm having you on is like I've started this YouTube channel and series and really trying to like pick apart like some of the best defensive minds in the sport of lacrosse. There's a lot of resources for offensive players. There's not as much for defensive players. I think getting your mind and your insight just on how you approach the game,
Yeah.
how you developed as a player overall, will be really useful for like younger guys in high school who are still learning and growing and developing. So certainly like love that I have you on and just want to pick apart your brain and kind of get the ins and outs and see how you kind of think about the sport of lacrosse.
Yeah, man. Adrian, absolutely. Yeah, not a problem at all. Yeah, happy to answer any questions you got.
So I guess the first thing is what do you think makes a good LSM? And then also looking at those skill sets, what do you think it takes to kind of develop them and how do you develop them, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, especially at the position, you have to be versatile. You have to, not only be able to pick up ground balls, you also have to be able to stop your opponent, but then also be able to, be able to catch and throw, run transition, especially
Mhm.
score goals. So you have to be, I'd say, a jack of all trades. And you got to appreciate the grind, when it comes to an associate with that, right? You have to enjoy getting the beat up on somebody, essentially take their lunch money away, and then really just double down and just stick it to the throat by scoring a goal.
Mhm.
So I think for that position, stick skills are so important. You have to be working on your footwork, and there's also a mindset too, where you have to be a junkyard dog. You have to enjoy contact, embrace the physicality of the sport, especially in between the lines, right? Especially on a face-off. When that ball's on the ground, it is utter chaos. And you got to have that heart and desire to, run through a tough ground ball, absorb those checks, or at the same time, lay the lumber on somebody as well.
So how did you kind of develop your skill set? Was it through, playing other
Yeah.
sports? Was it through watching other players? How did that kind of come about?
Yeah, I'd say so. In terms of development goes, I mean, definitely a dual multi-sport athlete. Like I was very
Mhm.
fortunate growing up that my parents allowed my brother and myself to play, every sport under the sun, whether it's football, basketball, hockey, baseball to a lesser extent. Actually, that's how I found lacrosse when kids started pitching. I got bored, but what you realize when you play sports, there's a lot of nuances in those sports that are very much translatable to lacrosse. I was playing all year round. I had a stick in my hand, but during football season, I'd only have my stick in my hand maybe once a week. Formally that is. I mean, I always
Yeah.
had a stick in my hand around, around my house. I'd be, walking around like dodging, the banisters or corners of the wall. Just,
Yeah,
again, having a
no,
stick.
it's funny.
Uh,
Like people are shocked. Like that's how you build up your stick skills. It's like you
yeah.
always have to have a stick in your
Yeah,
hand,
you're
and you
just
always got to be
yeah,
playing.
just moving around like usually like a fiddlestick, in the house. And then during usually the winter season, I was usually playing twice a week. Once usually like on a Wednesday or Thursday, and then on the weekend. And then summers and spring, and so spring and summer were really obviously kind of the main focal point was playing lacrosse. I was, I mean, listen, I was a mercenary for hire. I had played every opportunity that I got to
Mhm.
play. The amount of pennies that I have over my career from playing with random teams,
Mhm.
rec league teams. If somebody needed a body for a tournament, I was there playing because I'd say a lot of time now, people are too focused on these individual lessons. And again, I think they're very important in terms of honing your skills and making things secondly kind of like secondhand nature. But the beauty of the sport of lacrosse is that each situation is so unique. It's not a very scripted game, right? There's a lot of flow that's involved to it. And only really kind of get involved in those flows is if you're constantly playing and seeing those opportunities present themselves. So like I remember when I was growing up, I was at something like so. There's a Brewster Sports Complex, which is right by the ice arena in New York.
Mhm.
I mean, there would be days where I played 3 games in a row. I was only supposed to be there for one game, but my dad was nice enough to sit there and wait, let me play.
Yeah.
And I mean, like it was a running joke where I mean, they used to call me from Yorktown. It's like either like lacrosse prostitute or lacrosse whore because you just never knew when I was going to show up because I just
Mhm.
enjoyed playing so much. And I think that's a big thing where you have to get out there. You have to experiment, get out there, see these different situations. And, the other thing too is you got to challenge yourself. Uh, when I was playing, I never enjoyed playing against an opponent that was inferior to me, or kind of how I perceived it. I mean, listen, in sports, you can tell whether somebody's got it or something they don't,
Yeah.
right? So to go up to somebody who you know that you're gonna, twig, and then you're gonna pound your chest like you're the man, like that never got me excited. Like for
Mm.
me, I always wanted to line up against the best player that was out there. Again, I came from when I started playing lacrosse. I mean, I grew up in New Fairfield, Connecticut, playing lacrosse. Everybody, as soon as you hear the word New Fairfield, says, "Oh, you went to Fairfield." And it's like, no, they're very different places.
Mm.
So anytime I got a chance to go in front of people from Greenwich, Darien, Wilton, New Canaan, John Jay, Yorktown, Somers, anyone from Long Island, the big town. I was fired up to
Uh,
compete because I wanted to showcase my skill set. Even the guys down in in like DC or Maryland area, like guys, Boys Latin, Georgetown Prep. My goal, it's I wanted to embarrass people, like
yeah.
that's kind of what it comes
No,
down to.
like honestly, that's kind of an element of like I'm glad to like hear you say it, but like I think guys need to understand the mindset of what it takes to also be great. I'm really interested also just hearing about your training, right? Like how did your
Yeah.
training kind of evolve throughout college? I think a lot of guys early on don't realize, they get to college their freshman year, they don't realize how much you have to put in the fall, to really have a good
No.
spring. So I'd love to hear about your training, and because there's no way that you weren't putting in work like off the field. Like anyone who's
Yeah.
watching you play can certainly tell that you did extra stuff. So love
Yeah,
to
I
hear
mean,
about
listen, like for me, like you love having a stick in your hand, right?
that.
Staying after extra, per practice to shoot around, didn't feel work, or in my case, also to do face off work was not. Yeah, it's funny because like it's extra work, but it didn't feel like work in a
Mm,
sense because that's what you enjoy. I mean, this may not be the proper answer, but everyone kind of talks about being a student athlete, but what people when you go to college to play sport, I mean, you're an athlete first. It's just what it is. I mean, you have 40
mm.
guys depending upon you to be there, at all times. Even also if you're not obviously, a starter, if you're practice squad guys, everyone's depending upon you to do your job essentially. And I mean that so for me, again, I'd say in college, well, because when you go to college too, like I love lacrosse, but lacrosse is a lot when you come to college. Like to your point, I mean,
It's
fall
everything.
season's very long, and then all of a sudden you have obviously like a month or two break in between. But I remember my freshman year when we got to the tournament, oh my, like the final four, I was like, oh my God, I'm sick of this thing. Like I want to go home. I want to go home. I want to go hang out with my friends. Like it's a lot. It's
Mm,
very, very demanding. And I think what people need to, and again, but the reality is this, especially now after COVID years, at the end of the day, you only get four opportunities, to
yeah,
compete for conference championship, make it to the tournament, make it to the Final Four, win a national championship, right? So, I always find it very interesting where a lot of guys tend to get in their rhythm more their junior, senior year, where it's like, well, you just wasted two of your opportunities, right? And yeah, maybe obviously be maybe less mature because you're a freshman or sophomore from a physical standpoint, or even from a mental capacity. But you got to figure that out as soon as possible. To because again, like I said, there's a finite amount of opportunities.
yeah.
It is known when that chapter of the book's going to close for you, and you're going to start a new one. So how are you going to write that along the way? You can't kind of throw away years during those periods of time. But yeah, I mean, a lot. In hindsight, looking back, I think of things I wish I did better. I'd say probably done a little bit more on the side of additional footwork related drills. Um, some maybe additional endurance, and honestly, just eating better. It's
Mm,
amazing nowadays, especially what because yeah, I mean, listen, when you're back, I remember back at school. I mean, obviously, because you're working out, 3, 4 hours a day between running, lifting, playing lacrosse. I mean, you can kind of eat whatever you want and still look pretty, your physique's pretty strong. You're
mm,
still looking pretty good, right? But, again, for us, I mean, I was eating McDonald's, I was eating like Cookout, which is down south, there's a fast food joint. not the healthiest of diets in the world.
Yeah.
And you realize post college, how much that matters.
Yeah, you
Your
can't do that.
intake. No, you know what I mean? Like, I mean, especially now, like, I mean, like, my first year off the, playing lacrosse or on the desk working, all of a sudden, like, you start getting that muffin top forming, like, what's going on here? You're
Mm,
starting to eat turkey bacon and egg whites, and like you can't consume like you used to, so like,
yeah.
diet's a big piece of it too that I wish I knew and focused on a little bit more. I mean, again, I think it makes sense. Your intake, is going to obviously affect your output, but
Mm,
especially I think nowadays there's such much greater focus on diet, for players. I mean, for example, for me, now I don't drink during the season.
mm,
Especially in my age, it's just one of those things where you just lose too much time once
yeah.
you drink. The recovery time is just not there. So, you got to make the sacrifices if you
It
want to
really is
excel,
not there.
man.
Um,
So,
I would love to hear just about like also matchups you had in college. Were there any matchups that really stood out to you? And also just like how did you prepare for them mentally, right? Like
yeah.
lacrosse,
Well,
it's certainly team oriented as a defense, but at the end of the day, you have your matchup, right? And you're going against your top
100%.
O guy.
100%. I mean, listen, like I've always been in the big camp of right, do your job.
Mm,
Like if you do your job and not get beat, especially as an LSM, right? That means in turns that everyone else's job is easier because of that, right? So, definitely watch film, but the biggest thing to me, I think something that I think guys have to understand is that you have to have a confidence in yourself, right? There's a very thin line between, I'd say, kind of a, you know, like, swagger and arrogance versus like a cockiness, so to speak. Because if you don't believe that you're going to win the matchup yourself, you already lost that matchup.
mm,
It's kind of the same kind of mindset that you have to go into if you're into a fight. Like, I'm going to win. Because if you don't have that mindset and there's doubt in your mind that you're not going to win that matchup, you've already lost that. Especially with the competitors that you're lining up to, exactly to your point. I mean, as an LSM, you're going against the top tier talent on that side. All right. And the idea is, I mean, hopefully, they don't have to slide to you. And so I'd say, so the mindset and getting your head right, I'd say is the biggest thing. And again, I mean, I would be a big believer of kind of just visualizing things. You watch
mm,
somebody do something over and over, so you kind of just replay things in your head. Because more often than not, people tend to go back to what they know and what they're very comfortable with. And it's
mm.
very easy to pick up habits from guys by watching film. It's funny because again, like I mean, we're all creatures of habit.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
um,
I remember in college too, like I would watch every single thing about like what the guy's doing on the sideline. What's his tendency? Like, does he
mhm,
twirl his stick a little bit before he shoots? In summer ball, I knew the guy I was gonna be matching up against before
mhm,
the game. I'd look at what hand is he holding the stick in more,
yeah,
right? Like, let me try to pick up things on him and shade him more towards certain areas of the field. So that level of attention to detail it really gets honed in at the next level, uh, for sure.
absolutely. Because again, I mean, listen, like you have a bunch of stud athletes who are out there, so all of a sudden, what's going to be the thing that separates everybody? And more often than not, it's attention to detail and who's willing to work harder, right? There's, through my deaf scrolling one time on Instagram, I came across, Julian Edelman's talking to Brendan Marshall about, his work ethic with Tom and the number of routes that he's running. And I remember Brendan Marshall was absolutely flabbergasted about how hard. I think they were like you ran 100+ routes, during a session. And he's like, yeah. And you could see like Brendan Marshall was a freak when it comes to being an athlete. And Julian was just a
Yeah,
workhorse. And like imagine if Brendan Marshall was working that hard,
yeah,
what the results would have been. So, I think for a lot of athletes, because I think especially nowadays too, everyone's so accustomed to instant gratification with everything that people don't really see what's truly behind the scenes. The
mm,
work that gets in that shows. Like I mean, I think it's starting to come out with some of the stuff with like Kobe Bryant in the documentary of the USA team, or what Cristiano Ronaldo's been doing. Like, there's a lot of work behind the scene
yep,
because ultimately the game's like the fun part. That's kind of what it comes down to. That's why you
yeah.
think
I
guys
that's the
excel.
biggest thing is like studying those guys and realizing that success like leaves clues, and you don't need to
Mhm.
reinvent the wheel, right? Like figuring out guys that, have already found success and trying to emulate what they're doing, right? Like I remember being in college asking Larkin Kemp about a lot of the stuff that he would do, to try and find success and not really trying
Mm,
to reinvent the wheel at all. Um, I also do want to talk to you a little bit about being an off-ball defenseman because
mm,
a lot of people don't realize that that's really crucial at the next level and also at the pro level.
yeah.
Want to pick your mind about being an off-ball defenseman as well, and how's that developed for you over the years?
Yeah, I mean, in full transparency, I mean, that's also something that's constantly developing and getting better at myself as well.
Mm,
Because again, to your point, I think everybody's very much accustomed, especially when you get to college, a lot of the guys are number one guys, they're always on ball, right? They're usually having the best matchup, but all of a sudden you start entering and you're, small fish in a bigger pond where now all of a sudden you're developing other, capabilities that may not have developed. So again, I mean, it's sticking to the fundamentals, the basics, flat triangles, understanding obviously, 2 seconds on the man, 1 sec. I mean, that's 2 seconds on the ball, 1 second on the man.
hmm
Keeping it open. Trying to make sure that you're constantly communicating with your teammates through that process. Because again, there's a there is a tendency, and you can see it constantly. And again, been a culprit myself is that all of a sudden once the ball moves right, to your left or your right, whatever, you immediately stand up. And
Yeah,
as soon as you do that, smart offensive player is going to run off you.
it
Right?
doesn't take a lot for an
No,
offensive score goal. You just need to mess up a little bit.
100%. Because again, most people think you have to beat your man. The only thing that honestly an offensive guy now, all you need is your hands free. And I'd say the gold standard, and was like we kind of talked about when I was in college, the kind of the idea of crouching, being in an athletic position constantly. And the gold standard when I was in school was Jerry Burns' Notre Dame defense, where you could tell that those guys were sitting there the entire time, athletic position. They were never standing up. They were always alert,
Yeah.
kind of ready to go, which made them so difficult, to play against. And again, I mean, they've kind of morphed and changed a little bit because back when
Mm.
I was in school, Notre Dame, I'd say was more, especially on the offensive side, was much more kind of slower paced, playing for that perfect shot. Hence why there was a lot of low scoring games where, I think like, Ronnie Barzy
I
kind of
actually do. I
evolved.
do remember that Notre
Yeah.
Dame. Like even when you guys played Notre Dame in the championship game, that was like 5-4, right? Like it was a low
Six
scoring game.
five. Awful game. Awful.
Yeah,
From a
was it 5
spectator
4?
standpoint, it sucked. Oh, so
Yeah, yeah. I
boring.
remember just being like, damn, this is slow.
So boring.
uh, uh,
So yeah, so I mean, like, the thing is, you have to. I mean, I mean, you have to work on things that you're not good at, and I think people sometimes shy away from that because they're not good at it. But the only way you're going to get better at those things if you do that. Like one thing that kind of frustrates me when you watch nowadays. I feel like a lot of polls nowadays are not developing their stick skills. I almost feel like a lot of people have kind of, I don't know, given up or just not taught it, but it's very frustrating for me to watch a lot of polls, how they handle the ball, like in transition, as an example. For example, one of the big things I noticed is guys who are running a field, they're not using the whole entire length of their stick, right? So all of a sudden they're having like about a foot of their butt end exposed. Where I'm sitting there in my
mm,
head, I'm like, what is when you're like third grade, what are you taught to do to check somebody when they're running by you?
right. Go
The
right
bottom
foot.
hand. Go for that bottom hand. And also, like, is the butt end at the bottom of your hand better or like it's sticking out? Like,
Yeah.
it's like one of these, and then like on top of it, when you shoot the ball, why am I not going to use the entire length of my stick? Because that angle coming down is much more difficult for a goalie to see than if you're shooting closer. And it's just like,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's just people not taught. I'm not really sure, but like I cringe sometimes. I cringe a lot of time watching polls, carry like nobody's like walking the dog or anything along those lines, getting separation.
Yeah,
It's
walking
very
the dog that's like a lost art. You don't see that much anymore. I remember always watching Joel White. Joel White was a big guy who would choke up a lot, but he was like a short stick prior, right?
He
So
was.
like
So
he had that back.
it's funny you say that because it is kind of the Joel White effect. But Joel White was a freak. And
Yeah.
like Joel was, but the thing was also was very good with Joel was that Joel would also keep it in his body, right? So when he would run up field, he would one-handle
I remember
cradle,
that.
but he
Yeah.
would keep it there. Where I see a lot of guys more like two-handed, and when they're having it stick out extended. And but again, like I mean, he was also like, I mean, like a stick skill kind of guy. Like that's like a generational like
Mhm.
talent kind of thing that's going on, you know. So
Yeah, I guess that kind of spins off to another question. What do you think, watching guys outside of stick skills, what would you say are other things, youth players need to kind of develop just like in terms of where the sport's going, right?
I think that stick skill. I think just also ability to catch and also shoot the ball.
Mm,
You know, nowadays guys have to be. You have to be multidimensional, or it's going to be very challenging to make roster spots. Right? I'd say even now you're big bag defensemen who can just guard somebody. Those they're kind of falling along the wayside. Right? You're
mm,
going to have some sort of actual skill set that's involved in your game because there's so many more players that are entering the sport. Again, it's not just a Northeast or Mid-Atlantic sport. You're having guys who have played at a very high level, whether collegially or professional, go to these non-major markets like in Texas, Florida, Southern California, Denver, and all develop the game. But again, it's like it's the thing is this is like, how do you think you're going to have success if you don't practice something? Like I feel like a really good example on the offensive side is, when you see somebody throw behind the back in a game, and all of a sudden you're sitting there, I'm sure you've seen it with your teammates. It's like, I've never seen you once do that in practice. What makes you all of a sudden think now that you're going to be successful in the moment that you need to like be in that moment, right? I think for a lot of polls, like again, I see it even like professionally where guys will shoot, during games, but like they never once after practice ends or even during practice with the shooting drills, like joining the offensive guys. Just because you have a pole doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing those drills with
mm.
the offensive sides because you have to. Because the only way you're gonna get better and figure out your stick is by doing it. But it's kind of like like I don't know, like it's I kind of get a little frustrated when it's like when
Yeah,
like the internet like blows up or like Twitter or Instagram like oh pull a goal. It's like it's a skill set, man. Like
yeah.
it's like oh he got lucky he scored like, kind of a pull goal like it's a skill that you got to hone in and develop.
Another skill set that I think people really want to know is the ability to take away the ball,
Yeah,
right? With the new stick technology, it's virtually impossible to take away the ball. And on top of that, if a guy's playing on the field at the Division 1 level, he's going to have good stick protection, right?
yeah,
So the importance of being off ball and snapping back and seeing passing lanes and having your
mhm.
stick up and causing turnovers that way. How would you say players can kind of evolve and move with the game to cause more turnovers, right? Because when you played, it felt like you were a defender, but it felt like you were hunting, right? Like it
Yeah,
didn't feel like it didn't feel like you were playing defense. It felt like you were trying to cause and wreak havoc. How can defenders kind of check that?
yeah. I see, I mean, listen, you got to take your opportunities when they present themselves. You can't force things, right? So, I'd say anything that there's kind of scrums or, or odd, or, ball on the ground or, kind of plays of chaos, kind of looking for your advantage there. Cause I agree with you. It's getting harder and harder. Technology, guys are much better at keeping it in between their shoulder blades. The big thing I'd say that people don't realize is that it's not just about your stick, trying to eventually make contact with their stick. You got to
Mm,
be also physical with the body, right? Because all of a sudden, if you're all of a sudden driving somebody in the shoulder, right, and all of a sudden now they move, now you can come down and throw a check on there. So there's a big aspect of being physical with the, dodger or the guy you're covering's body first,
yeah.
so that he does. Because again, these guys are so good, right? Where you can just kind of sit there. If you're just kind of throwing checks, they'll kind of absorb it. It's not going to do anything. But all of a sudden, if you're pushing them and now all of a sudden they're moving in ways that they don't want to move,
So
that's all of a
I'm so
sudden where
happy
you
you bringing
open
this
up.
up because like I had a conversation with my dad about this, and this is one of the reasons why I really do think if you're not going to play other sports, you should at least watch a lot of other sports. You see
Mhm.
that in boxing, right? Like a lot of punches open up when fighters are like, you hit them with a hook, you hit them with a gut, and now they're not thinking about like holding their guard up high. Now there's shots up higher for their head and their head's open, right? It's the same thing in lacrosse. You push a guy on their hip 2 times really hard, they're gonna start forgetting about their stick. Now stick protection goes out the window. Now there's a chance and opportunity to dislodge the ball. So I'm actually really happy that you noted that for sure.
Yeah, no, I mean, listen, everything's a setup, right? I mean, like, when you think about checks, I mean, there's always like every check except for like the ding dong check, there's usually like a give and take between risk and reward. Now, I'd say like a ding dong check's like a high reward check where you're actually not giving up a ton of position. If you
Mm,
go over the head or you throw like a massive wrap check, you're going to lose a step. And if you don't land it, a rusty gate, you could smoke somebody in the jugular. There's a variety of things that could happen that can go wrong. Kayak check, same thing. You miss it, you hit a guy in the head. So there has to be thought behind it, right? If you're just throwing checks for the sake of throwing checks, guys are going to absorb those pretty easily, especially with the technology and just also, I mean, just how good athletes are.
mm,
I don't think people really also realize how effective a well-timed lift check. Because a lot of time guys are very taught to absorb, those, the slap checks. They're very strong, especially if they're running about to shoot or pass. They're going to wait till you pull up that stick and throw away. Whereas all of a sudden, if you sit there on their elbow and you wait for them to all of a sudden, throw a pass or a shot, and you just get a piece. I mean,
mm.
that could disrupt everything. I mean, it may, in terms of like, ball sailing, because guys are very particular too about throwing and shooting, right? So if all of a sudden you just throw like a little wrinkle like
Yeah.
that, where they're like they're about to pull through and you get a good little lift on them, they have no idea where the ball's going. The worst is obviously when you do get one good lift on them and it somehow goes in. It's like, dude,
Yeah.
where were you shooting that ball if that went in because of that lift?
I helped you. No, I mean a lot of like college coaches they call it the LC, the last shot, just the little
Yeah.
nudge, the little lift, the little dink. In my personal opinion, I think a good poke check to a gut almost always leads to good on ball defense. It just
So I
slows a
agree with
guy
you.
up.
100%. I do agree with you. Like, listen, when you think about, because I think another thing with a lot of people that, a lot of defensemen, I also don't think so, especially Dodgers from up top. You have to arrive to the man when the ball's arriving to the man, to the opponent. Because a
Mm,
lot of times I feel like guys, they give too much runway. Where all of a sudden you're starting 10 yards back and now someone's taking a full speed head start at you. What's the likelihood of you having success there?
Even if you're
Right.
the best athlete on the field, most LSMs are the best athletes. It's hard. Like it's who can
Right.
do.
And then to your point, what I was always taught, is exactly, if you throw a good poke check to derail them, to make them think about that, if you really want to be depends on how gritty of a player you want. I've been also taught from others where you go a little bit lower than the gut to
The
really
poke that
dislodge an
slides
ass.
down.
So it depends how so like 100%. And I think that's a little bit lost where some people say, oh, you can't, it's a little too mean or too aggressive. But like, listen, at the end of the day, man, that guy scores a goal and embarrasses you. Who cares? That's
Yeah.
your job to prevent from scoring goals. Midsection is part of the body, part of the body, and
Mm.
that you're there to slow them down.
I guess kind of last question everyone's gonna want to know the famous goal. Can we get a breakdown? What happened prior in the huddle? How do you end up taking the face
Yeah,
off? What were your thoughts when you were going just straight down the field?
yeah,
Love to
no,
hear about it.
absolutely, man. No, I mean, listen, like, when you think about this sport, I'm still a big believer that college is the pinnacle of it all. Just because of how much time that you do dedicate to it. And, we talked earlier, just about how long the season is from August all the way till, Memorial Weekend in May. And, I mean, for me, I got to go to the Final Four, every year. Like, I think I probably started going to Final Fours in like '02 or maybe even '04 or something like that. So like that was always a mecca to go there. So to be on that stage, I mean, in college I was on that stage 4 times, which was awesome. But obviously, you look back at that moment against Notre Dame. Is my favorite game that I've ever been a part of was actually the game against Virginia where we won 14-13 in the semis at night, up tempo,
Okay,
fast paced
I
game,
remember
up
that
and
game.
down.
Was that with the
Awesome.
Bratons? Were they?
Yes, they were playing. Yep, yep,
Okay,
yep, yep.
okay, okay.
And that was like my favorite game that I've ever been a part of in my life. So then you fast forward to, that Monday, this was a defensive slugfest. What a snooze for the spectators. 5-5. I mean, Scotty Rogers stood on his head, but it was funny because I wasn't the main face-off guy throughout the year. I was taking more draws towards the end,
Mm.
and I was taking more draws during that game. And I remember, I think it was like less than a minute left. We had the ball, and I remember I just kind of sitting on the bench, and I actually just like kind of sitting there, kind of just getting ready, like mentally focused. Wasn't watching the game at all. And I remember like Coach Gabrielli, who's our defensive coordinator, just come up like like kind of tapped me and like kind of gave me like the "you're up" kind of thing. And kind of because we went to overtime, and I was like, all right, here we go. And I remember going out there, and my whole objective going out there was literally just win the ball. Got
Mm.
a lot of good guys on offense. Let's just get the team with the best opportunity. Our guys, the offensive guys, the reason why they're getting their scholarships,
Yeah.
to give them the ball. And let's make this happen. So again, just do your job. And so I remember going out there. Again, you got to treat it like a regular face-off. So for me, I was a big jammer. So you punch hard with your left. So back in the day, face-offs were like kind of rock
I
paper
remember
scissors
you used
too.
to jam a lot.
Yeah. So like the moves are a lot quicker. So the jam has become obsolete nowadays. But so I jammed, punched hard through the guy's hit stick, and I'm kind of rolling out in front of me on the side. And I remember picking up the ground ball. And it's funny because people don't realize that the face-off game is a 3-man game. Everyone kind of focuses on the guys in the middle. But
Mm.
at Duke, it was the first time in college that I've ever actually been taught about boxing out. And so those guys did a great job of boxing out because I remember picking up this ball and I'm running down the field and there's nobody on me, on my sides, anything like that. And I'm getting closer and closer to the net. And at M&T Bank in Baltimore, where the game was, they have on the 20-yard line, they have a purple line there. So that means that you're 10 yards from the goal. And I remember running and like nobody's picking me up at that point. And it's like one of those
Yeah.
things where, especially on like when you're in overtime, you're playing I got my man defense, right? It's like, oh, are we gonna let Ned Crotty shoot, who wins the Torrington that year? Got Zach Howell, who's in the bottom right, in that bottom left corner, who he's had over 50 goals that year, I believe. Then you got Max Quinzani on the right side, who is one shy away from 200. So it's like, who are you gonna let shoot in that instance? And
Yeah.
I remember kind of kept the stick in front because that was like the biggest thing. And we were shooting low most of the game, and Scotty was saving a lot of them. So I remember them kind of shooting high. I ended up falling. I remember kind of sliding across the turf, and I saw the back of the net move, and it kind of like didn't register. And the first thing I heard was Max Quinzani scream, "Oh my God!" But his voice cracked like he just went through puberty, like a 12-year-old. And I just remember hugging him first, and then it was on, man. And I mean, it was a full-on dog pile. I remember being at the bottom of that pile and couldn't breathe, and it didn't matter. Like
Uh,
smiling ear to ear, like you're like basically on the verge of tears, and you're just like, if I went out that way, it wouldn't matter. Granted, after the fact, I kept some red receipts, after seeing some of the guys doing somersaults on the pile. But I mean, that moment at that period of time, like it's just, I mean, it's everything that you want, And again, to share it with my teammates, I mean, what it meant with the program after the scandal in 2006, to have some of those guys that went through that, to kind of end, their Duke career on a high note. I mean, it's everything, and it's been, again, I mean, everything that I feel like that worked for towards that. Started lacrosse in fourth grade. So yeah, no, it was pretty surreal.
no,
So,
no, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear the story and like the background, your perspective on it. Getting the ins and outs on it. I remember exactly where I was when you scored that goal. Like it was crazy.
oh, I appreciate that,
Yeah,
man.
but that's awesome. And thanks for doing this and taking the time.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
yeah, I guess that's pretty